Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to come and speak with you today and talk about this excellent resource. I'm very proud of it and the work that I've got to do on this. So it's really my pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this. So my name is Chris Campbell. You've already heard that, but I'm a gay, queer, cisgender man. Pronouns are he, him, and I'm a white settler with British and Scottish ancestry. I was raised in, and I'm still living in, Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is on Treaty 1 territory, and that's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland, birthplace of the Métis Nation. Now, I have a bit of a lengthy background in research, and the knowledge and experience that I bring to this toolkit has really been formed over years of work. So I'll just take a moment to sort of frame that, just so you have an idea moving forward what that looks like. So I worked for—
Sorry, could I jump in? Sorry, Chris, to interrupt. Could everyone please make sure their mics are muted? I can hear someone, sounds like typing. And yeah, someone else is saying that, Chris, you might be a little quiet. I'm not sure if I can do something to help with that, but
okay,
I'm
maybe
not sure, but just to let you know.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you. I think somebody has stopped typing or muted themselves, so thanks.
Lovely. Okay, well, I'll try to amplify my voice. If you could drop in the chat if that seems to work, that would be useful for me. Okay, so I worked for about a decade at the University of— lovely, thank you, at the University of Winnipeg with Dr. Catherine Taylor on a few large-scale national research projects that focused on 2SLGBTQ inclusive education. And I ended up being the research coordinator, which basically meant that I was involved in every aspect of research, from its design to dissemination. And so during that time, I worked on a range of projects. We employed a number of different methodologies, including quantitative and qualitative. And so I developed this wide array of skills and experience working with research teams, collaborations with community and professional organizations. We did some conference planning, budget management, research ethics, presenting and publishing, conducting focus groups, interviews, survey design and analysis. So kind of I hit all the big high points. And so when Gwen Thompson Hill initially contacted me about co-developing this toolkit for Royal Roads, I was really excited about the opportunity. I thought these toolkits are a great initiative, and I think they're one that's relatively rare in research departments, at least in my experience from what I've seen. And so I was just really excited about the prospect of contributing to it, and saw it as an excellent opportunity to put into an accessible form a lot of what I'd been learning and practicing over the years. I didn't arrive fully formed as you see me now, but it's the result of a lot of years of work and practice and trying different things at different times. So I guess it's worth noting that we couldn't fit everything in, obviously, but as Vanessa said, the goal was to really provide some of these high-level brief overviews of inclusion for 2SLGBTQ people at various stages in the research process. So I had the privilege to work with Gwen as co-author on this, or co-developer, and also with Vanessa in putting together the toolkit and this presentation. And I'm just really grateful to them both and to Royal Roads for putting resources into development of something like this. So, okay, in the next 20 minutes, I'm gonna try and give you a sort of a brief introduction to the toolkit. I'll try and touch on sort of the broad structure of the thing and some high points, and maybe dig into a couple of spots, time allowing, of course. Okay, so just before I get started, a quick note on the acronym that we use in this toolkit, 2SLGBTQ+. It stands for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or transgender, queer, and the plus is meant to represent sort of additional terms to describe sexual and gender diversity that may not be represented in the letters in the acronym already. And it's really supposed to be, or we're supposed to signal, an inclusive representation. So you may be familiar with or have seen different acronyms out there. They're used in different ways, sometimes to, like to distinguish who we're talking about. But for this toolkit, it was really aiming to be a more inclusive or signal a more inclusive intention. And part of why we chose this is because it represents, or it follows the practice of placing two-spirit, or the 2S, at the beginning of the acronym as a way to represent and honor and recognize the fact that the first sexual and gender diverse people in what we now call Canada were Indigenous two-spirit people. This is something that Elder Albert MacLeod has spoken about and shared with me. And it's a practice he's encouraged me to follow, and I think it's gaining, I guess, gaining usage across what we now call Canada. So that's sort of where, well, part of where that comes from. Now, there's a lot more that can be said on language, and I'm going to hit on it a few times as I talk today, so you'll get probably your fill of that as we go. But if you have questions towards the end, we can certainly return to those. But focusing in on the toolkit, so I've included on this screen just a screenshot of an image from the table of contents. I'll note this is a draft, so this is not the final version. The font, some of the page numbers may be a little different in the final, but that just, I wanted to give you a sense of sort of like the structure of the thing, how it sort of looks at a glance. So largely our aims for the toolkit were to encourage that thinking at a high level about inclusion of 2SLGBTQ people in research. And broadly, this means making space for 2SLGBTQ people in the research process, ensuring 2SLGBTQ people are thoughtfully and respectfully included in research design, and even providing opportunities for 2SLGBTQ people to speak to the research process, research questions that get asked, the methods we employ, and dissemination activities. And still, in many ways, this toolkit is just a starting point for thinking about inclusion in this regard. But to that end, we include some framings to help foreground our discussion in the toolkit, along with some core principles that can help ground your research process. Then we move on, discuss more specifically some considerations in research design, conducting research, both data collection and analysis, and a discussion of dissemination activities. And we sort of finish up, or towards the end, we have some further readings that you can turn to for deeper investigation and thinking for yourself. We also included two appendices that are sort of like deeper dives into a couple aspects. And one is on language, and the other is on queer methodologies. And the queer methodologies one, I'll just note, it takes a bit more of an academic language approach. So if you're interested in digging deeper and want to try and understand some of the theoretical and methodological and epistemological, et cetera, considerations, that's one place you can turn to, as in addition to our further readings. And the last thing I'll note about the broader structure is that throughout we provide sort of questions that you can ask yourself to prompt thinking about how to enact some of the principles we're discussing or presenting. And these are meant to help prompt you to reflect on the content and how it applies to your own practices. So you can keep an eye out for those in the toolkit. Okay, so I think I'll just go through sort of like blow by blow in a way and cover as much of this as we can. So our initial framings focus on providing some background information and rationale for this work, and also providing a brief discussion of language and its importance here. So as with many socially marginalized groups, 2SLGBTQ people have had a mixed experience with research over the years. Historically, research, including 2SLGBTQ people, was either used to impose judgment or stigmatize 2SLGBTQ people as being at risk, deviant, or somehow falling outside of acceptable social norms. And apart from these explicitly harmful research practices, often when 2SLGBTQ people were included, they were doing so sort of as an add-on or an afterthought, sort of just shoehorned into an existing design. And this doesn't always result in respectful inclusion, as research may inadvertently, as a result, invalidate 2SLGBTQ people's identities or experiences, simply because the research design hasn't thought about how to include them, or hasn't thought about what their inclusion may require in terms of additional work or modifications to the research design. So given that history, some of it continuing still, this toolkit really set out to try to summarize some of the key principles and practices for research that is inclusive of 2SLGBTQ peoples, offer discussion of these points and prompt reflection through questions for the readers, provide some resources and further readings, and generally advocate for the importance of inclusion of 2SLGBTQ people and perspectives in research that is respectful, thoughtful, and increases the likelihood of contributing meaningfully to disciplinary fields and to queer communities. So that's sort of our first framing. Our second framing is around language, and specifically recognizing that language regarding 2SLGBTQ people is vitally important and continually evolving. Because language is shared, socially shared, and one of the things in which we socially engage, it works to structure our understandings of the world. For many 2SLGBTQ people, finding the language that they use to describe themselves and their identity is really an important part of their lives and finding their place in the world and establishing their relationships. As social attitudes become more affirming of 2SLGBTQ people, more and more people have been able to reflect on their identities and their relationships and their own experiences. And really the result of this has been that 2SLGBTQ people's understandings of their own sexual orientations, gender identities, and relationships are continually evolving, resulting in new terms being used and affirmed. And there's a much longer discussion in the appendix with some key points, some takeaways there. But for now, I think the main point here is that this language is crucially important for 2SLGBTQ people in identifying themselves. And I think the implications for research are implicit in this or need to be considered. So finding ways through research to ensure that 2SLGBTQ people's identities are included accurately as they would like them to be included and respectfully is really a recurrent theme throughout the toolkit. So it'll come up a few more times and is really one of those framing principles for us. So it has implications for the type of data collect, how we represent 2SLGBTQ people and their identities, the questions we ask in research, and even what future research might look like for us. So moving on from our framings, we next offer up some core principles for research that is inclusive of 2SLGBTQ people. And what we include here are really some important principles that work as good baseline inclusion measures. And so they can really work to structure sort of your thinking about, or maybe act as what might we call that? A litmus test? That's a science thing that I don't know much about. They can really act as a sort of a test for enacting some of the research methods and changes and processes that we're discussing here. So the first principle that we have included is representation. And really the representation of 2SLGBTQ people in research matters. Making space for 2SLGBTQ people in research and providing opportunities is important, whether that's through sort of explicit invitations for 2SLGBTQ people to participate in your research, or in working to provide places for 2SLGBTQ people to provide feedback on research questions, your design and dissemination activities. You may have heard the phrase "nothing for us without us," and I believe that comes from advocates working in for accessibility related to disability. But it's really a good principle and one that's been taken up by a lot of social inclusion movements in thinking broadly about what's required here. So related to representation, involving 2SLGBTQ people and community is also really important. We've sort of seen a couple of ways, or I alluded to a couple of ways in the previous one. But this can result in deliberate partnerships and collaborations. And I think it also vitally includes getting to know and learning about 2SLGBTQ people and communities. This knowledge can really help to inform your research and ensure that you better understand the perspectives, representations, and histories of 2SLGBTQ people. And really that knowledge can just help inform in a more fulsome way how to include 2SLGBTQ people. Next, we describe the importance of empowering 2SLGBTQ people and their voices, both in being able to self-identify using a language that is affirming for them and accurate to their own understandings of themselves and their place in the world. So gender and sexuality and relationships are related, but importantly, they're all separate aspects of people's identities. It can be useful to think about these things in separate ways to help ensure that 2SLGBTQ people are empowered to speak about them as distinct aspects of their identity and of their social position. So further to this, thinking about gender and sexuality, it's important to remember that there's no singular experience of being 2SLGBTQ. Vanessa dropped a link on intersectionality in the chat earlier. And really that's the thing that we're trying to get at here, is that intersectionality frameworks and thinking in ways that are intersectional are important to understanding 2SLGBTQ people. We always try to recognize that other intersections of identity may impact our experiences. So thinking about race, racialization, class, socioeconomic status, disability, age, nationality, even primary language, things like this. These all affect the ways that we interact with one another in the world and experiences of marginalization in it. And related to that is the last point that we include here, which is social positionality. And in this instance, we're really encouraging researchers to take a look at their own social positionality and what we bring to our research. Understanding these social positions and how those social positions contribute to our experiences, understandings, biases, perceptions, our ideas about the world. All of these things inflect the kind of knowledge that we have about the world and that we bring to our research. Yeah, that's kind of the last point as our key principle is, I guess, beware or be aware. I shouldn't elide those. Be aware of your own social positions and the potential biases or privileges those bring in your understanding and your research. So turning to research design, we identify a few key points that may help us to consider some of the impacts of 2SLGBTQ inclusion for the way we design our research. The importance of context is key here. In discussions about research methods and methodology, we often talk about how our understandings of the world influence the kind of knowledge that we develop, and even what kinds of knowledge we consider to be possible or important. Since research seeks to develop knowledge about the world, it's important to recognize that participants may bring different understandings of the world into the research process. So making space for these understandings, seeking to understand that context, is really important for 2SLGBTQ people because their experiences shape their social, political, cultural, material realities. I talked a little bit about that when it came to language earlier on, and that's a big part of what's going on here. But thinking about really knowledge as being inextricably embedded in context is what we're trying to get at here. We go into a lot more detail on that in our appendix on queer methodologies, which I already gave a shout out to, but I'll do it one more time there. Equally important, and again, somewhat related to this, is intersectionality, and understanding that there's no singular experience of being 2SLGBTQ. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the person that developed the concept of intersectionality, says that intersectionality is a lens, a prism, for seeing the way in which forms of inequality operate together and exacerbate each other. So again, it's important to remember there's no singular experience, and it can be important when you're designing your research to think about how you're going to get at multiple marginalization or make space for that, and thinking about people's experiences. Neglecting multiple marginalization may erase important differences among diversity within 2SLGBTQ communities and among their experiences. So thinking about that in your design might be an important consideration early on. Coming to that, making thoughtful choices about what methods you will use, and that requires that you take an honest look at, or maybe an in-depth look at what ways these choices limit the knowledge that you're going to be able to develop. Doing this during the research design means that you may identify early on important limitations. And that gives you an opportunity to consider potentially other methods or supplemental or mixed methods that may help you to fill in those gaps or address those shortcomings. And the final thing I'll talk about here is thinking about research design, or in thinking about research design, is that you may consider ways of developing a research team that includes 2SLGBTQ members. So this could include inviting 2SLGBTQ researchers within your field or your discipline, or it may involve creating like a queer advisory committee, partnerships with local organizations or community organizations, and really seeking to find ways to be inclusive of 2SLGBTQ voices. Throughout this process, it's important to remember that if you invite 2SLGBTQ people to provide feedback or advice, you need to make an effort to listen to it. Maybe that seems patronizing in a way, but I think it bears repeating. I've sat on a few advisory committees and had, I think, important considerations being dismissed, or just not accommodated when it would be very easy, or dismissed because it wasn't the way research was done, quote unquote. So I think that's an important consideration. So I just make it there. And the final piece about sort of these inclusive research teams is to try and find ways to meaningfully compensate people for their labor and contributions to your research process. Now, this may be financial compensation, and if you can do that, if there's any possible way you can do that, that's always a really great way of doing this. But there may be other ways to discuss other forms of compensation, other things that you may be able to offer. That second half is really important in working with community partners, because they may have needs that you may be able to meet rather than giving them money. They may have research needs. They may have events that are coming up that it would be great for you to help with. These kinds of things are other forms of compensation that may be really useful. And as sort of a rationale for that, I'll just slip this in there as we get through. I always like to remember that social marginalization plays itself out in real material ways for marginalized communities, and that includes 2SLGBTQ people. Often that includes things like financial or economic implications as well. So recognizing that compensation is an important part of addressing social inequity is one way to do this, and it really materially communicates appreciation for people's time, their reflections, their intellectual and emotional labor that they're really bringing to your work. All right, moving on to data collection. When it comes to data collection, 2SLGBTQ inclusion is largely a matter of putting into practice a lot of the things that we've already been talking about, or seeing through those design principles that we've already worked on. We have 3 main points here. The first is, well, I guess we have 4 main points. The first is collecting accurate data. And that means ensuring that 2SLGBTQ people are able to self-identify in ways that affirm their own identities. Again, that's the language thing. We've talked about that a few times. But for survey research, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Offering options and space to specify further or explain responses can be really useful. So not just having like, like heterosexual and other, and just sort of like keeping it like that, but offering additional opportunities for people to specify. As a side note, I always try to provide space for that, the classic quote unquote other please specify option. And standard research practice really provides a list of options and then that other category. And for my own practice, I always try to avoid that other language, just because othering language often communicates that something is outside the norm or just inconceivable beyond the range of options. And so I always try to be thoughtful about how I provide that extra option for people to specify or to tell me further information. One strategy I use is for sexual orientation. I'll say something like another sexual orientation as a prompt for people to specify further, with the intention of being invitational, I suppose. A second point here is recognizing diverse individual experiences. Hopefully you're reading intersectionality into that already. Really means that you're enabling people not only to use their own language to describe themselves and their own identity, but recognizing that intersectional piece, that multiple marginalization may also be impacting their experiences and the responses that they're providing to your research questions. So when you collect data, think about how you can try to get at these experiences using intersectionality analysis to understand or try to get at data that will speak to compounding or unique experiences of marginalization or just responses for your research. Ultimately, in thinking about the questions I'm asking for any piece of research, I'm always thinking already about analysis. And my good general principle is to have a plan to make use of, to analyze, to report on everything that I collect. Even things that sometimes may seem extraneous, if you have a plan for how you're going to use them, there can be a good rationale for including them. And I think when it comes to intersectionality, I think that can be a really useful part of developing some subgroup analyses if we're thinking about statistical analyses. And in qualitative research, it can just really be having that conversation and following participants where they take you. Okay, so the final point here, and one that I haven't really touched on so far to date, so I'll take a moment and I'm going to give you an example, is the importance of creating robust data in research for 2SLGBTQ people. So there's a lack of reliable population-based demographic data on 2SLGBTQ people in Canada. And developing a greater understanding about the number of people who identify as 2SLGBTQ and what their experiences are is really useful. And I think a really important part of doing research right now. Developing this population-based demographic data really has implications for, well, a number of different ways, but generalizability of sample is one thing. Also, because we sort of lack that data at present, it's always hard to make any sort of generalizable claim about 2SLGBTQ populations because we can't really say whether it's representative of general populations. There's limitations to the ways that happens, but at present we're sort of implicitly unable to do that unless we're doing longitudinal sort of studies or we have good reason to justify it otherwise. So looking at this quick example here, so I included this Statistics Canada data from the Canadian Community Health Survey in 2015, and they reported on the sexual orientation of their respondents. And they found that between the ages of 18 and 59, 1.7% of the Canadian population identified as gay or lesbian, and 1.3% identified as bisexual. In a subsequent later analysis, they broke that down by age categories, and we saw that really there were higher percentages of LGBT people among the younger participants. There's sort of like that little curve that happens, with 5.8% of 15 to 24-year-olds identifying as LGBT, and sort of falling from there as participants got older. In contrast to this, in a study in 2011, I guess the data was collected in 2009, 2012, but the final results were published in 2011. And this was research on school climates related to 2SLGBTQ experiences and perspectives of youth in high schools by Catherine Taylor and Tracy Peter. And part of their research design was conducting these surveys in schools that included whole classroom settings. So it would be sort of representative of high school students or that age range. And from this data, they found that 14.1% of students identified as 2SLGBTQ. That, to me, is sort of like a shocking difference between what Stats Canada is finding and this other body of research. And there is also other research that I didn't include, but that looks at whole population sizes, and there is around the 10 to 15% of youth reporting being 2SLGBTQ. So we might ask why this is the case, and there are a whole host of reasons that this could be the case. And yeah, a couple of them. Let's just do a couple of them. It may be due to higher levels of acceptance for 2SLGBTQ people among youth. There could be that broader social shift that's happening in social inclusion of 2SLGBTQ people. The important developmental stage of questioning for sexual orientation and gender identity development, that's happening right in that age range, so there might be more openness to considering or thinking through those things. And it may even come down to, and I think importantly, whether participants trust that they can report this data. When I think about Stats Canada and the way they collect data, I remember until I was like 18 years old, my mom was filling out the survey. So I would never have been recorded on that form as being gay. So that may be another way, like data collection sort of matters in that regard. So it's good to remember that supporting robust data collection enables the development of research practices that can further investigations and inclusions of 2SLGBTQ people. Even if it's not for your current present research, it starts to develop sort of that data set that will feed future researchers, future projects that are going on, as well as developing that more reliable sense of how many 2SLGBTQ people there are. So similar to data collection, data analysis, we're mainly enacting principles we've already been discussing. Accurately depicting gender and sexuality, I think, is a key part here. Because if you're allowing space for 2SLGBTQ people to self-identify using their language and respecting sort of their self-identifications around that, as accurately as possible, it's good to reproduce those and reflect what has been handed back. I think the intersectionality piece here as well is important because subgroup analyses, again, 2SLGBTQ experience is not monolithic. So breaking out, sexual orientation from gender identity, trans, non-binary people, ways to do that, as well as racialized 2SLGBTQ people. Those all provide interesting insights and are under-researched areas in general for a variety of reasons. It's also really important to be explicit and accountable for the decisions you make for these things. So not every analysis is possible, depending on the number of participants you have. Again, thinking about statistical analyses, the types of analyses you're able to do sometimes really hinge on the number of participants you have and the number of subgroups you sort of are able to develop to do some of these more nuanced or detailed analyses. So thinking about the decisions you're making and being accountable and explicit with those decisions and why you've made them is really important in your research. And finally, just the general note on the construction of analyses is that the analyses you do sort of structures the data you have and the findings that you're able to pull out there. So thinking carefully about what's possible and being accountable and explicit about those decisions is a big piece there. And then the final section that I'll touch on here is dissemination. And this is the part where we get to hand everything back to the world, report what we found. And one of the main ways that we can seek to be inclusive of 2SLGBTQ people is to find ways to present findings directly to 2SLGBTQ people and communities. Our academic go-to venues, our academic conferences, scholarly journals, research reports, those are all good and really essential places to publish this data. That affects, there we go, your discipline and the conversations that get to happen there. But also reporting directly to your participants, the people that have usefully contributed to your research, is a really important piece. So thinking about community-oriented approaches, I think, is a really important way to do that. If you have members of your research team who are 2SLGBTQ, or if you partnered with organizations that are 2SLGBTQ or have 2SLGBTQ memberships, that's sometimes makes the process easier because you've got some ready-made moments to speak to your population right there, ready to go. In dissemination, remember to use clear, accessible language and practices for presenting your findings. Again, there's the accessibility toolkit that has been developed. That's a great one. We've tried to follow those practices as much as possible with the current toolkit. And there's great, easy ways to make use of those in presenting your findings. And this really brings me to my last point. I've already spoken to my third bullet point there, so I'll just leave it for now. But my last point today is really about seeking ways to accurately report your findings. Be mindful about the language that you use and avoid as much as possible inadvertent sensationalizing of your findings regarding 2SLGBTQ people. This may seem obvious, and something that we would just never do. But I'll provide an example in just a moment about how this can play out in a way that I don't think was intended, but had some interesting consequences. When we find surprising or novel things, obviously we want to highlight those. And we just want to make sure that we don't inadvertently misrepresent 2SLGBTQ people or contribute to further marginalization or social discourses that have created some of those inequities to start with. And it may be useful to pay attention to some of the historical discourses and the ongoing ways that 2SLGBTQ people are marginalized or oppressed, and try to find ways to counter those in understanding our findings. Okay, so a recent example of this, let's look at something that happened in the US, why not? So the CDC produced this report on the number of transgender people in the US, and that came out just in June of this past year. And they drew data from a number of different surveys, and through statistical modeling, they estimated sort of this generalized sense or estimate about how many people identified as transgender in the US. Now, I won't get into the details of it, but on the right, we can see how that was reported in the media. And it was, well, basically what it says. They reported that, the report said that there's a, quote, sharp rise in transgender young people in the US, which feels like a really, I don't know, sensational thing to say. In general, in the US, and I think this is why it's important, is that there's a lot of conversation about sexual orientation and gender identity, and this often figures in the media as debates. And the thing that occurs during these debates, and just by their sheer existence and their prominence in the media, is that it validates the idea that being 2SLGBTQ is controversial, and that somehow it's legitimate to disagree about 2SLGBTQ people's right to exist. So further to this, earlier that year, again, we're sort of still diving into this example, a Gallup poll from 2021, so just the year before they do sort of this yearly reporting, they found that 7.1% of Americans identified as LGBT, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So on the screen, there's an image about how it was reported. basically LGBT identification in US ticks up to 7.1%. I'll also note that this appears in the politics section of their website, which is another thing. But in the text of the article, in the first couple of paragraphs, this sort of gets further reinforced, this narrative about the increase in LGBT people. They say that from the 2020 survey, or the 2020 survey reported that 5.6% of Americans identified as LGBT. The number of LGBT people had doubled since 2012 when they first started measuring it. So they're developing this really clear narrative that, oh, we're swinging up. There's so many LGBT people now. And the framing is continually the number of people rising, the number of people increasing. And I think this is just really actually misleading. So the actual numbers of 2SLGBTQ people has not necessarily increased or changed at all. The number of people who feel safe enough to identify as 2SLGBTQ has increased. Or we could say that 2SLGBTQ people now have greater access to language or social understanding or less social stigma. They have social acceptance to identify as 2SLGBTQ, so they're more willing to. So the problem is not with 2SLGBTQ people, it's with these social discourses and attitudes that go along with it. And as we see greater acceptance, we see an increase in the numbers of people. So really these explanations are rooted in the decreasing social stigma that enable people to more willingly question their sexual and gender identities, and ultimately to identify as 2SLGBTQ people. So in response to this Gallup poll in particular, comedian and political commentator Bill Maher, of Bill Maher's Real Time, whatever that show's called, he claimed that the rise of LGBTQ youth was quote unquote trendy. And he said, and I quote, "If we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054. So that's a very shallow reading. Like, that's buying right into the narrative. The number of people is going up. It's doubled in the last decade. Therefore, if that keeps happening, oh no, there's going to be queer people everywhere. Now, the problem is this wasn't a joke that he made. It was an odd commentary about how somehow people's identities were frivolous or somehow inaccurate or couldn't be trusted. And it also cited all of those historical narratives that we're familiar with about how being 2SLGBTQ was somehow bad or something to be feared in broader society. So this is my last slide, we're almost there. This last one, and I saw someone on social media make this comparison. They brought out this side by side. And I saw it circulating this past summer after these stories and these conversations were happening. And on the left, there's a graph depicting the number of people who are left-handed. And you see in the early 1900s, the number of left-handed people was down around 3%. And by 1970, the percentage of left-handed people rose, quote unquote, to 12%, where it remains stable. And to understand what's happening here, you have to remember that with the advent and expansion of public schooling, there was this movement to sort of limit the number of left-handed people there were. So they would punish people that wrote with their left hand and enforce them writing with their right. My grandpa, my dad, two great examples. So we're both right-handed as a result. And so this practice gradually stopped. And as that practice stopped, there was an increase in the number of people who were able to identify as left-handed. That's not exactly what's going on, but it's a fairly good analogy for thinking about how the rise in LGBTQ populations may be related to some of these social attitudes and stigmas. So that's really the place where I'll end. For me, this forcefully illustrates the importance of accurate reporting and understanding context and explanations for some of the findings that we're seeing. And for 2SLGBTQ people, this is a time of increasing social acceptance is what we're finding right now. And that means that it's also time to ensure that our research practices make space for 2SLGBTQ people in ways that allow them to participate equitably in research. Apologies, I think I went a couple minutes over what I intended to, but I hit my stride at the end. Thank you.